Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that everything that has gone wrong in your life was a direct result of a decision you made. Not someone else, not fate, not bad luck, but you. That is the uncomfortable truth that sits at the heart of what is happening with Iran right now, and no matter how much the regime tries to spin the narrative, deflect the blame, or point fingers at Washington, Tel Aviv, or Riyadh, the mirror keeps reflecting the same face back at them. The Iranian leadership had choices, real, tangible, legitimate choices, and at every critical fork in the road, they looked at the path that could have led to prosperity, stability, and respect on the world stage, and they walked the other way. That is not an opinion, that is a pattern, and patterns do not lie. Think about where Iran could be right now if its leadership had chosen differently. This is a country with an extraordinarily educated population, rich natural resources, a deep and ancient culture that commands global admiration, and a geographic position that could make it one of the most important trading hubs in the entire Middle East. The potential was always there, staggering potential, the kind that other nations would envy, and yet the regime took all of that and lit it on fire in pursuit of an ideological agenda that has brought nothing but suffering to its own people and instability to the broader region. When the nuclear deal was on the table, when diplomats were sitting across from Iranian officials with a framework that could have provided sanctions relief, economic integration, and a path toward normalized relations, the hardliners inside Tehran's power structure made sure to poison every serious attempt at progress because for them, the revolution was never really about the people, it was about power, control, and an obsessive hostility toward the West that has become the regime's entire identity. And that is the tragedy buried inside all of this, because the Iranian people themselves are not the enemy of anyone. They are the victims of a government that has consistently chosen its own survival and ideological purity over the basic needs and futures of millions of citizens who deserve so much better. The economic devastation that ordinary Iranians live with every single day, the inflation, the unemployment, the lack of basic goods, the brain drain as young educated Iranians flee the country in massive numbers, all of it traces back to decisions made by a regime that would rather fund Hezbollah, arm the Houthis, and pour resources into proxy militias across the region than invest in hospitals, schools, and economic infrastructure at home. And when the consequences of those decisions arrive, when sanctions tighten, when military pressure mounts, when the international community responds, the regime stands up and plays the victim, wrapping itself in the language of sovereignty and resistance while the actual Iranian citizen stands in line wondering how to afford bread. That is the accountability gap that never gets addressed honestly enough, because accountability means tracing consequences back to their true origin, and the true origin of Iran's current situation is not American aggression or Zionist conspiracy. It is decades of deliberate, calculated choices made by a leadership class that prioritized regional dominance and theological absolutism over the dignity and prosperity of its own nation. The world did not impose this reality on Iran out of nowhere. There were negotiations, there were agreements, there were moments where a different future was genuinely within reach, and each time, the regime either violated its commitments, escalated its provocations, or used the breathing room it was given to advance the very programs and behaviors that triggered the next round of consequences. So when someone like Hannity says the Iranians could have avoided all of this, the point is not to be callous or dismissive of real human suffering, the point is to be honest about where responsibility actually lives, because real change, lasting change, the kind that actually helps the Iranian people, can only begin when the regime stops pretending it is the innocent party in a story it has been authoring from the very beginning. Have you ever watched someone walk straight into a wall they were warned about 100 times and then act completely shocked when they hit it? That is exactly what we are watching play out with Iran right now, and the frustrating part, the part that should make every serious person stop and think, is that this was not a surprise to anyone who was paying attention, because the warnings were loud, they were clear, they were repeated over and over again by multiple administrations, multiple allies, multiple international bodies, and yet the Iranian regime looked at every single one of those warnings and made the conscious decision to keep walking straight toward that wall anyway. This did not happen overnight. This crisis, this pressure, this moment of reckoning that Iran now finds itself in did not materialize out of thin air or emerge from some sudden shift in geopolitical mood. It was built brick by brick over decades of defiance, provocation, and a breathtaking arrogance that seemed to genuinely believe the consequences would never actually arrive. When the United States drew red lines around Iran's nuclear enrichment program, those were not empty words thrown into the diplomatic ether for theater. They were serious, documented, internationally backed boundaries that the global community agreed upon, because a nuclear-armed Iranian regime is not just a regional problem, it is a civilizational one, and everyone from Washington to Paris to Riyadh to Tel Aviv understood exactly what was at stake. And still, Iran pushed. Still, the centrifuges kept spinning. Still, the enrichment levels kept climbing past every threshold that had been established as a point of no return, and with each violation, with each escalation, with each moment where the regime tested the patience of the international community and found that patience still holding, they interpreted restraint as weakness and doubled down. That is the part that is so maddening to watch, because restraint is not weakness, restraint is strategy, restraint is diplomacy giving itself one more chance to work, but there is always a point where restraint runs out, and the Iranian leadership seemed constitutionally incapable of understanding that fundamental truth. Beyond the nuclear file, look at the proxy network that Tehran spent years building and funding across the region: Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militias embedded throughout Iraq. Each one of these groups was a warning flag, a flashing signal to the world that Iran was not interested in being a responsible regional actor but was instead committed to projecting power, destabilizing neighbors, and threading its influence through every conflict zone it could find. The international community did not ignore this. Sanctions were imposed, designations were made, intelligence was shared, diplomatic pressure was applied, and through all of it the message was consistent and unmistakable: this path leads somewhere you do not want to go. But the regime had a response to every warning, and that response was always essentially the same: defiance dressed up in the language of resistance, sovereignty, and anti-imperialism, which sounds noble until you realize that the people bearing the real cost of that defiance are not the Ayatollahs living behind fortified walls but the ordinary Iranian citizens watching their currency collapse and their opportunities evaporate. What makes this even harder to process is that the warnings came not just from adversaries but from voices within the diplomatic world that genuinely wanted a different outcome. European nations that bent over backwards to preserve the nuclear deal even after significant violations, mediators who stayed at the table long past the point where most would have walked away, international inspectors who documented everything with painstaking precision and gave Iran every possible opportunity to course correct. None of it landed. None of it produced the kind of genuine strategic recalibration that would have actually changed the trajectory, because for the Iranian regime, acknowledging the warnings would have meant acknowledging limits on its power, and that is the one thing this leadership has never been willing to do. So here we are, at a moment that was telegraphed years in advance, watching a regime absorb consequences that were promised, documented, and entirely predictable, and the only real question left is whether anyone inside that power structure finally has the clarity and courage to understand that the next warning might not come with another chance to listen. What would you do if someone handed you a key to a door that could change everything, your future, your family's future, your entire country's future, and instead of using it, you threw it on the ground and walked away? That is the question that haunts the entire Iranian story when you look at it honestly, because the door was real, the key was real, and the opportunity to walk through it and into a completely different future was placed directly in Iran's hands not once, not twice, but multiple times across multiple administrations, multiple negotiating frameworks, in multiple moments where the international community extended something genuinely rare in geopolitics, a real, workable off-ramp, and Tehran's hardliners looked at it, picked it apart, delayed it, violated it, and ultimately chose ideology over the lives of 85 million people who deserved so much better from their leadership. The nuclear deal alone, whatever your politics around it, represented a moment where the world was essentially saying to Iran, here is your chance, here is the framework, here is the pathway back into the global economy, back into legitimate trade, back into a future where your people are not suffocating under the weight of sanctions and isolation. And rather than seizing that moment with both hands and building something lasting from it, the regime treated the agreement like a tactical pause, a breathing room to quietly advance the very ambitions the deal was designed to constrain, and when the violations mounted and the trust evaporated, they stood at the podium and blamed everyone else in the room. That pattern of behavior is not just frustrating, It is revealing, because it tells you something essential about who is actually making decisions inside Tehran and what they genuinely value. And what they value is not the welfare of the Iranian citizen. It is not economic growth. It is not regional peace. It is the perpetuation of a revolutionary identity that requires an enemy, requires tension, requires the United States and Israel to remain permanent villains in a story the regime has been telling itself for over 4 decades, because without that story, without that conflict, the entire justification for their grip on power starts to crumble. Diplomacy was not just on the table in the abstract sense, it was actively pursued, energetically pursued, by people on the American and European side who genuinely believed a deal could hold, who genuinely believed that economic integration and normalized relations could create incentives strong enough to shift Iranian behavior over time, and who put enormous political capital on the line to make those negotiations work. Back-channel conversations happened. Quiet communications happened. There were moments behind closed doors where people on both sides of the divide were closer to a genuine breakthrough than the public ever knew, and each time, the hardline faction inside Iran's power structure found a way to poison the well, whether through provocative military moves, through the actions of proxy forces that created crises at the worst possible moments, or through internal political pressure that made any Iranian official who genuinely wanted compromise look like a traitor to the revolution. And the Iranian people watched all of this happen to them, not for them, because nobody who actually cares about a population uses their suffering as a negotiating chip while simultaneously blocking every exit that could relieve that suffering. And that is precisely what the regime has done, kept its own citizens in a pressure cooker while telling them the heat is coming from outside when the hand on the dial has always been inside the house. The off-ramps were real. The opportunities were genuine. The moments where a different choice could have produced a radically different present were not fantasies constructed in retrospect, they were documented, they were offered, they were there. And the tragedy is not that the world failed Iran, but that Iran's leadership failed Iran in the most consequential way possible, by choosing a revolutionary pose over a livable reality, by choosing the performance of resistance over the substance of progress, and by throwing away key after key after key while the Iranian people stood on the other side of that door waiting for someone, anyone, in a position of power to finally have the courage to use one.